Hello everyone and welcome back. So a lot of museums display a lot of information. They have dates, they have material, they have provenance, they have historical research, they have context. All of that matters, but information and interpretation are not the same thing. The difference is important because facts alone do not automatically create meaning, and information alone does not automatically create connection. So I thought in this video we should dive into the difference between simply displaying facts and information and interpretation. As always, remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel and add your comments below. And let's dive into this. Information tells us what something is, and it helps us identify what something is. It can be the type of object, the date, the place, the material, the maker, historical background, and this is essential. Without good research, there is no good interpretation. So it presents the content. But information on its own often stops at identification. Interpretation goes further. Interpretation helps visitors understand why something matters. It creates meaning between the content and the visitor experience. So why this object, the story, the place, the event deserves their attention? I would probably put it something like this. Information identifies, interpretation connects. Information gives facts, interpretation gives significance. Information tells us what we are looking at. Interpretation helps us understand why we should care. And that is the key difference, because interpretation is not just about passing on knowledge, it's about creating meaning from knowledge. So one way to think about this is as the difference between facts and meaning. And that matters because facts on their own do not always tell us what something meant in lived experience. It is what did this object do in someone's life? What did it control? Who owned it? Who made it? What did it make possible? So interpretation asks these things meant in relation to everything from labor, travel, scarcity, trade, survival, identity, and memory in the lives of those who use the object. Another way to think about the difference is context versus connection. Information often provides context. It tells us where an object came from, when it was used, who made it, and so on. Again, all of that is important, but interpretation asks a slightly different question. How does this connect to the visitor? Not by forcing false relevance, not by turning everything into entertainment, but by helping the visitor find a point of entry. And that point of entry can be emotional, it might be visual, it might be social, it might be practical, but it creates a connection. So another way to look at interpretation is this thing that happens in the middle zone between historic facts and visitor understanding, between content and experience, between research and communication, and between what happened then and what can be grasped now. Another way of looking at the difference is object data versus visitor relevance. And museums are very good at collecting data about things, and rightly so. They need catalogue records and measurements and classifications, condition notes, all of that, historical documentation. But visitor relevance is something else. Visitor relevance asks, why should I stop here? What should I notice? What is interesting, moving, surprising, or worth thinking about? So interpretation might say, look at these uneven repairs. This dress was kept going, not casually replaced. So now the visitor has something to notice, something to think about, something that points beyond the object itself. So data describes the thing, interpretation directs attention and creates relevance. Interpretation has always, for me, been the meeting point between content and experience. And I actually talk about this in my very first video, where I try to identify what actually is interpretation. I'll link to it below. But to me, it's always been this meeting point between content and visitor experience. So for example, on one side, you might have the content. This is typically objects, stories, spaces, text, panels, novels, expertise, research, all of that. On the other side, you have the experience the visitors bring. Emotions, feelings, memories, personal knowledge, previous experiences, also the social context within which the visitor visit your museum, their expectations, their state of mind, all of that. And interpretation happens in the meeting point between these two. It's not just the content alone, and it's not just the visitor response alone. It is the bridge between them. It is the connection, the translation, the relevance, and the meaning making between these two. So I would probably define it something like this. Interpretation is the meeting point between historical content and visitor experience. And that is also why two people can stand in front of the same object and not interpret it in exactly the same way. The content may be the same, but the experience they bring is very different. Now, I wanted to return to this idea about interpretation as translation, because that is actually a very important point for why interpretation matters so much. A lot of historical research does not arrive ready-made for public audiences. It can be dense, it can be specialized, it's often distant, fragmentary, full of assumptions that made it sense and gave meaning to it in one time, but might not anymore. And that needs translation sometimes. Some things are perfectly acceptable for us in today's society, but might not be in 100 years' time. I think a very obvious example that I know a lot of museums often struggle with is the concept of slavery, which practically existed in every single culture around the world at some point, but which today, of course, obviously is unacceptable. But a concept like that, which was in many cultures at some point in history completely normal, can be very, very difficult to get your head around and to fully understand and grasp in today's society and in today's mindset. Interpretation often involves translations. I don't mean translation in the sense of reducing complexity, and not in the sense of, dumbing down, obviously, but translation in the sense of making meaning available. It means turning specialist terms into understandable language, turning chronology into significance, turning detail into focus, turning context into connection, turning research into something people can actually see, feel, or think with. I think if we are to try and summarize this a little bit, I would probably say that information identifies and interpretation connects. Information gives facts, interpretation gives significance. Information tells us what we are looking at. Interpretation helps us understand why we should care about it. I think interpretation is the meeting point between historical content and visitor experience. And that's also why good interpretation translates research into meaning or something that is meaningful. Good interpretation does not replace research, it translates it into meaning. And I think that is a key point, because very often we can feel, I think, when we work in interpretation and historical research, that we often feel a bit sort of like we're standing on two opposite sides of the fence and we're trying to reach each other in a way. But the thing is, the two things complement each other, and one cannot really function without the other. And I think it is in that field, that middle zone, if you like, that interpretation really happens. So yes, museums need information, they need historical fact. Historical work needs facts, and interpretation without good research very quickly become weak. And I think it is essentially to remember that information alone is not interpretation, because interpretation is what happens when historical content is shaped into meaning in relation to a visitor. It is in that space between fact and the feeling, between the object and the encounter, between the research and the moment of understanding. And this is why interpretation matters. It is not simply about telling visitors what something is. It is what helps them understand why it matters. How would you look at information and interpretation together? How would you define both? And do you have any good examples to show that might help explain this? Please add your comments below.